Welcome, my friends. Welcome to episode 67 of the Corbett Report, the 9/11 Money Trail. Now, of course, the Corbett Report has been concentrating on the 9/11 myth, and deconstructing that myth has been one of the primary objectives of this podcast and the Corbett Report website since its inception. But over 7 years after the events themselves, and after years of painstaking research by a number of researchers into the events, some of the interesting avenues of investigation have become so convoluted as to be almost impenetrable to newcomers. Indeed, at this point, if the 9/11 Truth Movement's goal is to continue to expand and reach new audiences, it needs to do so in new ways. People who have not yet been exposed to, or not yet been convinced by, the ample evidence of extreme physical anomalies on that day, from the controlled demolitions of the towers to the very unusual events at the Pentagon and in Pennsylvania. If people are not interested in that evidence, or even the evidence that has been thoroughly documented by people like Webster Tarpley about the drills that were going on at the exact same time as the events that they were representing, then what is another way to get people into this? Of course, the investigation into the physical anomalies of that day is still of prime importance, but the research into those physical anomalies has now become so voluminous, so convoluted and impenetrable to outsiders or newcomers to the movement, that the impression is given that only credentialed experts could possibly decipher what really happened on that day. Likewise, many other avenues of investigation have been exhaustively explored by painstaking researchers like Webster Tarpley, who has done some of the best research on the drills that were taking place on that day that simulated the very events that were happening in real time. Again, I would direct listeners back to episode 20 of the Corbett Report for that incredible research. And of course, the research of Indira Singh is another very important piece of this puzzle. And I cannot recommend strongly enough for new listeners to the Corbett Report to go back and listen to episode number 45, in which we highlight Indira Singh and the P-Tech 9/11 software. But it seems to me that there is another avenue for investigation, one that's often overlooked, yet in fact is one of the easiest to understand at a basic level, and one that offers an extremely fruitful area of investigation. In fact, perhaps the base of all serious criminal investigations on events of this magnitude. People have often heard the refrain, "follow the money," and of course an event like this is absolutely no different, even if you were to believe the official fairy tale of what happened on 9/11. You would still have to admit that following the money is of prime importance. In fact, one of the most important things that we can do to try to unravel what really happened on that day. Unless, of course, you listen to the 9/11 Commission. Yes, of course, the 9/11 Commission says that, don't worry, go back to sleep. There's nothing interesting to look at if you're interested in the financing of 9/11. Here's a quote directly from Chapter 5 of the 9/11 Commission report. Quote, "To date, the U.S. government has not been able to determine the origin of the money used for the 9/11 attacks. Ultimately, the question is of little practical significance. Al-Qaeda had many avenues of funding. If a particular funding source had dried up, Al-Qaeda could have easily tapped a different source or diverted funds from another project to fund an operation that cost $400,000 to $500,000 over nearly 2 years." End quote. Yes, it's of very little practical significance where Al-Qaeda got the money for the attacks from, because Al-Qaeda could have gotten that money from many places, because Al-Qaeda has many different sources of funding, and since Al-Qaeda can get that money from many different sources, we don't have to investigate how Al-Qaeda got that money. Does anyone else get the impression that perhaps the 9/11 Commission report had come to certain conclusions about who did finance the attacks before the report was even written? Yes, I thought so. Well, let's explore some of the very troubling issues related to the 9/11 financing and hopefully, ultimately, come to a better understanding of how the attacks were perpetrated and by whom. And today we'll start with one of the most obvious and basic examples of how one individual stood to make $4.5 billion off of this horrific and tragic loss of life.
Silverstein, a commercial real estate tycoon with international political connections, acquired a 99-year lease on the World Trade Center complex in the spring of 2001. Throughout the summer, he reworked the insurance policies on his new property, making sure that it was covered for acts of terrorism. Explicit in the lease agreement was Silverstein's right to rebuild the complex if it were destroyed. After 9/11, Mr. Silverstein fought his insurers in court to obtain double his policy limits for the destruction of his property, maintaining that the double hijacking constituted 2 disasters caused by terrorists, not just one. He won and was awarded over $7 billion, a magnificent return on his original $15 million investment. Not long after the disaster, Lower Manhattan saw banners like this one. Although they were idolized as cathedral-like symbols of power and triumph that pierced the New York skyline, the Twin Towers were big money losers for the Port Authority of New York. They cost millions a year to equip with the basics: electricity, water, heat, air conditioning, sewage, and even oxygen, being airtight. As modern communications connected traders from all corners of the globe, tenancy in the Twin Towers continued to drop. The towers presented another problem. Decades ago, their steel beams had been sprayed with fireproof asbestos, a cancer-causing material banned from use in building in the mid-1980s. Although the World Trade Center complex was given several waivers, it was expected to clean up its act. But to remove the asbestos from every supporting beam in the Twin Towers would have been almost undoable. Quotes for this cleanup ran over $1 billion, and no insurance company was willing to bear the cost. An urban renewal project of unfathomable proportions. Given the tower's issues and problems, September 11th proved an unexpected bonanza. The Trade Center was built in the 1960s to revive a rundown area of New York, and 40 years later, urban renewal could again take place. 2 white elephants were removed, and a brand new complex is in the works. The full height of the new Freedom Tower will soar to 1,776 feet.
Of course, Lucky Larry's acquisition of the World Trade Center just weeks before 9/11 is by now a well-known story, but one would be advised to check a Bloomberg.com article from 2007 entitled "Silverstein Insurers Reach $2 Billion WTC Settlement" for details of the final settlement, which brought to $4.55 billion the amount that Larry Silverstein made for the deaths of those thousands of people in the World Trade Center on that day. As I say, that story is fairly well known, but another story which is not so well known comes from a report from the Populist Party, populistamerica.com, from April 5th, 2007, Giuliani versus the Firefighters. This article reads in part, quote, Giuliani's cult hero status went untarnished and unchallenged until he decided to decline an invitation to the International Association for Firefighters Forum, open to all presidential candidates for Q&A. Mainstream news then picked up on the story and exposed the contention between the former mayor and the real heroes, the New York firefighters, who lost so many of their friends and compatriots in the attacks of that day. All was not well in Oz, and finally someone had alluded to the mask shadowing the truth. A great rift exists between Giuliani and the one group America assumes to be his staunchest allies. What did Giuliani do that so outraged the firefighters and their families that they would still hold such a grudge against him 5 years later? One cannot understand the source of this contention unless one has done some real and difficult research into the events of that day. In November 2001, our members were